What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
1-833-288-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN Radio, the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. If you have a question about the Catholic faith, give us a call. If you are concerned about where things are going in your life and you're thinking, well, you know, maybe the Catholic Church has it all figured out, give us a call. If you're disgusted with the Catholic Church for some reason, maybe something happened to you years ago, and you'd like to talk about that is keeping you from becoming a Catholic, give us a call. Any of these things, lots more in the coming hour of our program. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. You can also call, if you're listening outside of North America, 205-271-2985. Be sure you put the U.S. country code in there at the very beginning of all that. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for our response, and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. And, of course, you can always shoot us an email, ctc@ewtn.com is the address, ctc@ewtn.com. Charles Beery, our producer, Ryan Penny is our phone screener, and Jeff Burson's on social media. So, if you're watching right now or listening on YouTube or Facebook Live, put that question in the comments section. Jeff will shoot that to us here in the studio. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
I'm good. Good. How are you, sir?
Oh, you know I'm doing decent, thank you.
You know, it's been about a week or two since I've gotten a lunch update from you. So what was it today?
Oh, today was brown rice, broccoli, carrots, mushrooms, chickpeas, and grapes.
Doggone healthful. Good job.
Thank you.
All right. Leading off here with an email from Daniel, who says, "Hi there. I've been reading Dr. Dander's book, The Catholic Church Saved My Marriage, and I read the chapter where you discuss the sacramental nature of marriage from a scriptural perspective. And I have to admit, as a lifelong Catholic, I have never heard the argument put together in a more compelling way. Can you briefly summarize the difference between the Protestant view of marriage and the Catholic view of marriage, and how the Catholic view leads to a happier marriage, even in this life? How do all these rules and restrictions lead to a happier marriage? Thanks and God bless, Daniel."
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. I really appreciate the question. So, major differences between Protestant and Catholic view of marriage. The most important difference is that the Protestant theologians, by and large, well, almost universally, rejected the idea that marriage is a sacrament. They thought it was a divine institution. They thought it was instituted by God, and that it had a real, moral claim on our lives and on society, but they denied that it was a sacrament, meaning they did not see it as a sacred sign of God's union with his people, accompanied by a promise of grace that would suit one particularly for that state of life. They denied that it was a special ecclesial state in the church, the way that Catholics understand it, and it could be effected validly and legally as a civil contract. So that was a major difference. Concomitant with that, they also denied that the church had the kind of unique jurisdiction over sacramental marriage that Catholics hold. So in the Catholic Church, it's conspicuous that because marriage is a sacrament, for other reasons as well, the church claims jurisdiction to certify whether marriages are valid or invalid, and to establish canonical norms for the valid celebration of the sacrament. And Protestants rejected those, rejected both the sacramental nature of marriage and the Church's unique jurisdiction over Christian marriage. And some of the practical consequences of that, most importantly, is Protestants rejected the Catholic view that because God gives Christians grace to live the arduous demands of marriage, they rejected that. They regarded indissolubility as an unrealistic aim. Right, and so they did not hold to the absolute indissolubility of a valid marriage, but contemplated the possibility of lawful Christian divorce and remarriage. That is a unique Protestant contribution, well, if you will, not contribution, but a deformation, change in the understanding of marriage. The first Christian divorces in history were recognized in the city of Geneva. Robert Kingdon has a good book on that topic, the history of that, called Adultery and Divorce in Calvin's Geneva. And that really was the signature issue dividing Protestant and Catholic in the 16th century. Can Christians lawfully divorce? The Catholic Church had always said no, and the Protestant Church to this day says yes. Now, the logic underlying that concession in Protestantism was essentially grounded in a recognition of humanity's moral weakness and frailty. And if you read Luther's writing on marriage and sexuality, he goes a long way towards believing that these are sort of incurable wounds in our nature and that you have to make legal and cultural concessions to them. That eventually plays out in the modern Protestant world in, as far as I can tell, a kind of wholesale embrace of the hedonistic sexual ethic of the secular world. Now, before Protestants freak out when hearing me say that, I recognize that Protestant theology today confines sexual activity within the context of Christian marriage. So they don't you shouldn't have sex outside of marriage. Most Protestants believe that. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to how you behave inside of marriage, there's really no distinction, right, in the Protestant sexual ethic and what you would get out in the world. I mean, I've myself done some research on this from Protestant agencies like Focus on the Family, which is a kind of signature authority on Christian marriage for that community. And when they give advice about sexuality within marriage, it's largely indistinguishable from what you would get in secular understanding of how you conduct yourself sexually. Catholic Church has a very different view on the nature and purpose and conduct of sexuality, even within marriage, and says there are things you should do and shouldn't do, because ultimately sexuality is ordered towards the procreation of children and the spiritual friendship of the spouses, and we shouldn't objectify one another for our own hedonistic pleasure.
Okay. Daniel, thank you so much for your email. If you have a question that you would like to send to Dr. David Anders via email, you can do that any time of the day or night, at ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. All right, in just a moment, we're going to get to some of these calls. Linda in Galena, Illinois, Vicki in Union, Missouri. We have two lines open at the moment, 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986, or you can text the letters EWTN to 55000. Back in a moment or two with lots more here on Call to Communion on EWTN. To Communion.
The wisdom of Mother Angelica.
You remember the time I said on the air, go to confession. And when you're done, go out and have a big ice cream soda. Celebrate. And a man wrote to me, he says, you know, I hadn't gone to confession in 30 years. Do you mind if I went and had a pizza? I said, oh, have 20 pizzas.
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.
The leading Catholic voices are on EWTN Radio.
Every single day, I get to help our listeners of the Sunrise Morning Show wake up, find out what's going on in the church and the world, and then walk with them as we all seek to grow in knowledge and love of Jesus Christ and the Catholic faith. I mean, how could it get any better?
The Sunrise Morning Show with Anna Mitchell and Matt Swaim. Tomorrow morning, 6 Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Check out EWTN's official YouTube channel.
Just follow the link on our homepage at EWTN.com or go to YouTube.com/EWTN.
Watch EWTN's live shows or today's homily from the Daily Mass.
Click the upload button to see our most recent clips.
You can also find all of EWTN YouTube content by clicking the playlist button.
It's all on the official EWTN YouTube channel at YouTube.com/EWTN.
Visit.
Hey, you can carry EWTN with you everywhere when you download the EWTN app. It's absolutely free, and you can enjoy EWTN live TV and radio streams audio and video on demand, EWTN News, program schedules, prayers, devotionals, so much more. And again, it's absolutely free. Download the EWTN app by going to EWTNapps.com, EWTNapps.com, or you can go to the App Store of your choice, if you prefer that. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We begin with Linda in Galena, Illinois, listening on Sirius XM 130. Hey, Linda, what's on your mind today?
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I really enjoy your show.
Thank you.
I have a question about Stoicism. I think, Dr. Anders, you've mentioned it on your show in the past, referring to it, but I didn't really know what it was, and I still don't. But a coworker of mine was saying that it really helped him to maintain positive attitude, and he himself is Catholic, and he said, he didn't think reading it necessarily detracts from Catholic faith. I have a family member that I think could benefit from this. According to what my coworker told me, this family member is very strong in their faith, so I'm not really worried about them going astray necessarily, but I wanted to make sure that this is something that Catholics, is more quote-unquote safe to read, and is this something that you would recommend, and if so, do you have any books that you would recommend?
Well, yes, I do. Yes, I do. Okay, so Stoicism, of course, is a movement in Greek and Roman philosophy that was really ordered toward the question of the control of the passions. And Stoicism is a source for modern psychotherapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. Many people working in those fields in the 20th century turned to Stoic writers for insight in the nature of afflictive emotion and for techniques to combat and deal with those. And like lots of Hellenic and Roman philosophy, this was the intellectual world in which early Christian theology was constructed, and early Christian writers made selective use of Stoic concepts and practices, even as they relied very heavily on Neoplatonic metaphysics. So we're not afraid of secular philosophy as Catholics. We're going to appropriate it as it is useful for helping us to apply or articulate the Christian faith. So some of the Catholic writers who made avid use of Stoicism and Stoic concepts would be Clement of Alexandria and his successor in the catechetical school there, Origen of Alexandria. Through Origen in the Eastern tradition, you get Evagrius Ponticus. His book, The Practicus, is as an application of Stoic methodology to the regulation of the interior life. Through Evagrius, it gets translated to John Cassian in the West. The Conferences of Cassian are an application in a monastic context of Stoic practices. Cassian influences, in turn, St. Benedict of Nursia in the Benedictine tradition, Gregory the Great. Through him, Thomas Aquinas, and on into the modern world. So all of the, and let me also emphasize Ignatius of Loyola, the spiritual exercises. All of these are texts in the Catholic tradition that make use of Stoic terms and concepts and methods. So just to recap, Clement of Alexandria, Origen of Alexandria, Evagrius Ponticus, John Cassian, Benedict of Nursia, Gregory the Great, Thomas Aquinas, and Ignatius of Loyola. Now, some specific books that would be of great help to you. Far and away, I think the best introduction to this topic, the application of Stoicism to Christian spirituality, and I highly recommend it, is a book by Joseph Nguyen, and I know I'm mispronouncing the Vietnamese, but it's that common Vietnamese name that no American can say, Nguyen. Joseph Nguyen, S.J., Jesuit theologian, and the book is called Apatheia, which is a Stoic concept, A-P-A-T-H-E-I-A, Apatheia in the Christian tradition. And it's exactly on point with what you're asking. How can I take Stoic concepts and apply them in the practice of Christian spirituality through the lens of sacred tradition? That's exactly what Father Nguyen's book is on. If you want a sort of higher-end approach to the same topic, Richard Sorabji, in his Gifford Lectures entitled Emotion and Peace of Mind, traces the lineage from Stoicism to early Christianity. And then there's a nice little dissertation that's public domain on the internet by Gao Yuan called Freedom from Passion in Augustine, on the Stoic influence on Augustine's philosophy. So there's a lot of resources for you.
Absolutely. Linda, is that helpful for you?
Oh, that is very much. And can it help people who are struggling with mental illness too?
Okay, so the key Stoic insight is that we are not our thoughts, all right, and that we sort of we have freedom. We're not our emotions, I should say. We're not our emotions. We're not our passions, and that passions can arise in us through a number of sources, but we have the capacity to reflect rationally on those passions and discern how we're going to cope with them, and whether we're going to let them lead us down a dark path, or whether we're going to try to attain a certain measure of equanimity or distance from those passions. Mm-hmm. Now, soundness of mind is both constitutive of, and to a certain extent necessary for, the practice of Stoic discipline. If you're psychopathic and you don't have a good grasp on the distinction between the mental and the real, you're going to have a hard time discerning, when your passions are leading you irrationally. Mm. If it's garden variety neuroticism, yeah, that's what it's meant to cure. Okay. But if somebody has something like schizophrenia, Stoicism may be of limited value. But if it's just a garden variety, neurotic, like most of us are, then yeah, this is going to be really helpful.
Linda, thank you so much for your call. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call to communion on this Wednesday afternoon here on EWTN. Let's go to Vicki now in Union, Missouri, listening on the Great Covenant Radio, a first-time caller. Hi, Vicki. What's on your mind today?
Hi. Thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
My question and my history. My question is, am I, at this point in my life, welcome to go back and receive communion in the church? And my background is that I was married in a Catholic church at age 19, had 2 children, and after 20-some years, infidelity resulted in my divorcing my husband, no annulment, and then I was married again briefly, and that also was divorced because of infidelity in a civil ceremony. I am now married to a wonderful man for almost 20 years again. Good marriage, but it was also a civil ceremony. So I have not, I'm just wondering if I'm welcome to go and receive communion, technically being divorced Catholic.
Okay, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So first of all, when it comes to the first relationship, where you divorce the man because of infidelity, that is actually permissible in the Catholic Church. So sometimes horrible things can happen in a marriage, and it becomes just morally and psychologically impossible to cohabitate under the same roof, and Catholics can have recourse to civil divorce in such instances. Now, that's different from the question, can I go lawfully remarry? That's a different question. When it comes to whether you can lawfully remarry, then we have to discern what is the nature of that first relationship. Was it a valid marriage or not? And it's not as clear-cut as you might think. So just because you had a church wedding does not guarantee validity. There's a strong likelihood, I would think, that if this fellow was committing adultery and infidelity, that he may not have been the sort of person who was capable of realizing the demands of marriage. And if the church were to look into that, and there's a system for doing that, it's called a marriage tribunal, they would likely find that he was not equipped to take on the demands of marriage, and therefore the marriage itself was not valid, and you would not be bound by that. The second marriage is absolutely not valid, all right, because it didn't have canonical form, so that's going to be easy to find. And this third relationship was not conducted according to canonical form, so it's not going to be regarded as a valid sacramental marriage in the church. But it could be. It could become a valid sacramental marriage, and you have to jump through a couple hoops. The first one is to get that first marriage annulled. The second marriage will be falling off a log easy. The first one probably will come through without a hitch, would be my guess. When you get that annulment, then you're free and clear to realize a valid sacramental marriage with the man you're with now, and then you're good to go. So look, it's a process. It's a lot of people find it uncomfortable, and it can take a little while, and that can be frustrating. But, we got the rest of your life, and you're aiming towards eternity. And
Right.
for many people, once they've gone through that, they're so glad they did it because they've cleared the air, they've got certainty about their marital and sacramental state, and they can go receive communion and the rest of the sacraments with a clean conscience and total openness and objectivity. And it's a great place to be. I mean, I know I had to go through something similar in my own conversion to the Catholic faith. I had to get my marriage convalidated. Tom Price did the same thing.
Yep.
Both of us are glad we went through the process. Now we have certainty. Now we know where we stand, and we're in happy, joyful communion with the church. So you're Catholic. We love you. You didn't stop being Catholic when these things happened. You've had some hard times in your life, and the church wants to be there for you compassionately to help you on the way. And really, this is a ministry of service, just so you have got certainty in your own life.
Vicki, thank you so much for your call. And would Vicki begin the process at the parish level, or would she go directly to the marriage tribunal?
I'm glad you go to the parish.
Okay.
You just go to the parish, and the priest will help you out. He does this all day long. He knows what to do.
Very good. Vicki, thanks again. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. Let's go now to, looks like Sarah in Independence, Kentucky, listening on Sacred Heart Radio. Hey, Sarah, what's on your mind today? Hey, Sarah.
Hello. Hello, Dr. Anders. Thank you so much for taking my call.
Absolutely.
I was raised a Baptist, as was my sister, and I became Catholic, and my sister became disenchanted with Christianity. She's having trouble reconciling a good God with some hard Old Testament passages like the ban, and specifically she brought up the trial of waters from Numbers 5:11 through 31. The NIV reads that it induces a miscarriage, though other translations just mention, like, your thigh withering. And I was wondering if you could help reconcile God's goodness with passages like this, and especially this one.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate the question. So first of all, I'm going to recommend a resource to you for when we get off the air, and you can go read some stuff. The book is called The Dark Passages of the Bible by Matthew Ramage. You won't find its equal. It's a magnificent way to understand how to approach these and others similar texts in the Old Testament. When it comes to Numbers 5 specifically, I think you need to attend to what the ceremony actually enjoins on the accused and the accusers. And you'll find that it's very different from trials by ordeal in other cultures, right? And a lot of times in the ancient world, trial by ordeal was a kind of presumed guilty until proven innocent. We're going to tie you up, throw you in the lake, and if you sink to the bottom and die, you are innocent. Well, that doesn't do me much good, right? If you float, you're guilty, we're going to take you out, That's not the way this thing is constructed, right? You're actually supposed to write out the accusation against the accused on a parchment, wash it off in a pot of water, have the accused drink the water, and then if her belly swells and her thigh wastes away, she's guilty. In other words, when was the last time you drank some dirty water and your thigh wasted away and your belly swelled?
It's been a while.
Okay, so in other words, it's going to take a miracle. Right? For you to get a conviction, it's going to take a miracle.
Yeah.
Now, this is a bizarre ceremony that reflects the cultural condition of an Iron Age, pre-axial age people in the ancient Near East. But it's vastly different from what you would have seen in other cultures in terms of their treatment of women. This one actually requires that if a husband makes an accusation, there's got to be a kind of divine vindication of the charge before this woman's going to be prosecuted.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there you go. Sarah, thank you so much for your call. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. Real quick question here from Andrew, who wants to know, could you please explain the Catholic stance on evolution?
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate the question. So Pope John Paul II, in 1996, in an address to the Pontifical Academy on Science, mentioned that the theory of evolution is more than a theory, right? That it really is sort of the bedrock of modern biological sciences, and it's the most robust theory we have right now to explain the evolution of species, Darwinian evolution, I should say. And of course, that's the overwhelming consensus of natural scientists, Catholic and otherwise, operating in the field. So Catholics have gone to when the theory is first articulated, a number of Catholic theologians had no problem with it whatsoever at all, because it didn't seem to contradict anything intrinsic to Catholic theology. Right? Catholics have never taken the first 3 books of Genesis as sort of literal history of geologic time, but have seen them in an allegorical way as a depiction of humanity's relationship with God and alienation and sin and the promise of redemption. And so it hasn't been overly difficult to reconcile this developmental understanding of the origin of species with an understanding of God's providence. And it's to a certain extent it falls outside the purview of Catholic theology because it's empirical science, it's not divine revelation, and yet it's easily reconcilable with divine revelation.
Andrew, thanks for your question. Back in a moment with more Call to Communion.
El Cresta, Jonette Williams, Father Robert Spitzer. You'll hear the leading Catholic voices on the largest Catholic media network in the world. This is the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hello, family. Our world has been turned upside down by the coronavirus pandemic. Concern for our loved ones, economic uncertainty, and of course, social distancing. It's easy to understand why there's such great anxiety and fear in the world. I'm convinced that God is using this moment to bring us closer to Him and to strip away the distractions of our normal daily lives, and that He is calling us to place our trust in Him. In this difficult moment, EWTN is a great spiritual resource that can help you, your family, and friends make sense of the chaos. Of course, EWTN is where you can turn for Mass every day. In addition to our television and radio channels, you can also find the Mass, live Eucharistic adoration, the Rosary, and other devotions on our web and video on-demand platforms. And of course, EWTN News will continue to provide you with the latest updates on the pandemic, as well as other current events around the world from a Catholic perspective. Please know that we're praying for you, and let's also join together in prayer for our EWTN family around the world. Thank you, and may God bless you.
Are you prepared to vote?
Citizens have co-responsibility for society. The moral theology tradition teaches that one may not vote for an enemy of religion or of freedom, except to exclude a worse enemy of religion and of freedom.
Learn more so you're prepared when you vote this November. Visit EWTN.com/vote for everything Catholic voters need to know before picking up a ballot.
Hi, this is Jonette Williams. You don't have to be a woman to enjoy Women of Grace tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern here on EWTN Radio. Now back to Call to Communion with Dr. David.
Glad you're with us on the Wednesday afternoon edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN. You just never know when you're doing live radio, are the phones going to catch on fire, or are they just going to sit there, waiting for your call? Today is one of those on fire days. We are totally sold out on phone calls, so I'm not going to repeat the phone number. That would just be frustrating for everybody. Let's go to Gus in Lafayette, Louisiana, listening on the EWTN app, a first-time caller. Hey, Gus, what's on your mind today?
Hey, thanks for taking my call. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
My question is in regards to end-of-life care. I'm a physician, and it's regarding a patient who has a pacemaker and is pacemaker dependent. Essentially, if the pacemaker wasn't working, they would go into cardiac standstill and die. The patient has requested that the pacemaker be turned off. Is that something that's permissible?
I really appreciate the question. The answer is no, this is not permissible. This is not permissible. Now, there are a couple distinctions we can draw. A pacemaker the battery can run out. It can become defective, and in order to have a working pacemaker, you'd have to go in and do a minor surgery to replace it. You don't have to do that. So if the pacemaker stops operating because it's faulty or the batteries run out, you're not obligated to replace it. You're not obligated to do everything possible to keep somebody alive. All right, because the intervention to save the life can be disproportionate to the expected benefit. And there can be a lot of ways of measuring that. So, for example, if you live in a society that you don't have medical insurance and things would be prohibitively expensive, some particular therapy, a trilogy machine, for example, that might cost $100,000, in the West, you might get it from your insurance plan. If you live in West Africa, you might not have such a plan.
Right.
You can't mortgage 3 generations of the family's farming land to for a trilogy machine to keep grandmom alive for another 6 months. Right. You don't have to do that. You don't have to do every medical intervention possible to keep somebody alive. On the other hand, you can't intentionally kill them. You cannot do something with the intention of hastening their death. You can do stuff that would alleviate their suffering, but you can't hasten their death. Now, the only reason you would turn off a pacemaker would be that you intend to hasten their death. And you can't do that.
Okay. Glad you clarified that. Dr. Gus, thank you so much for your call to communion here on EWTN. Let's go to John in Cleveland, listening on AM 1260, The Rock. Hey, John, what's on your mind today?
Hello, Tom and Dr. Anders. Nice to be with you today.
Thank you.
This is my question. For a person who was lawfully married in the Catholic Church, under what common circumstances would the act of civil divorce be offensive to God and a sin? And under what common circumstances would the act of civil divorce not be offensive to God and therefore not a sin?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So when we marry, we make a promise that we will be there for one another in sickness and in health, rich, poor, better and worse, until death do us part. And I don't get out of that promise because my spouse becomes, fat, ugly, stupid, lazy, boring, whatever accusation I might make, that I find it unpleasant to live with this person, does not allow me to violate my promise to be there and care for her or him if you're a female until death do us part, right? And I don't love you anymore. You're not pretty. You're not the woman I married. We just don't have anything in common anymore. None of those are valid reasons to divorce, right? And they would violate a break of that promise, of that vow. And it would be deeply wrong. It'd be deep because we rely on one another to get each other to heaven, to meet one another's material needs as well, to be a prop and a comfort in old age. All these things are goods and ends of marriage, and I don't get a pass just because it no longer is exciting for me. Now, on the other hand, if my spouse goes crazy and comes after me with an axe, I'm gonna turn around and run out the door, right? I mean, it's not at that point it becomes literally impossible for me to fulfill the demands of marriage, because this person is unwilling to live civilly with me in the house, and that's no fault of mine, right? It's a moral necessity. Mm-hmm. Here's another situation: if let's say my spouse or your spouse or somebody's spouse begins consistently profaning and blaspheming God and the faith in the presence of our children.
Ooh.
And this has been known to happen. Mm-hmm. And then and I'm sitting here thinking, well, how do I fulfill the ends of the domestic church and of marriage and of raising children in the faith and so forth if my spouse has completely abandoned the faith and is blaspheming God and the church in front of the kids? It might become morally necessary, for the sake of the welfare of the children, to remove them from that situation. Similarly, a parent who is on drugs or an alcoholic or a serial infidelity, gross immorality, these kinds of things that could be very, very spiritually, morally, or physically harmful to other members of the family, might necessitate a physical separation. But it has to ultimately be motivated by these kinds of considerations that are ultimately love and the common good of the family and the spiritual good of the individuals involved. So simply saying, well, I don't love you anymore, or you're not pretty, or you're boring, or you're fat, or you're poor, or you cost too much, or none of those are valid reasons. And certainly not, I fell in love with this other person. I mean, that's a crazy reason.
Yeah.
And no reason at all, and that's what you just call adultery.
John, thanks so much for your call. A quick question here from Soné, watching us on YouTube today. Soné says, can you please explain to me the concept of redemptive suffering and why we offer the body and blood of Jesus in reparations for the sins of other folks? I thought Jesus continually does this in heaven.
Okay, thanks. So redemptive suffering means that when we accept the hardships that come in our life, trusting that they happen within the providence of God, then that act of surrender to divine providence is meritorious. It has value, right? And Christ is our model. St. Paul tells us in Philippians 2 that because he was obedient humbly unto death on a cross, that God exalted him to the right hand. Jesus expressed this kind of surrender when he said, not my will, but thine be done. When we do that, we, like Jesus, merit reward from God for our willing surrender to divine providence, which takes a tremendous act of faith, because sometimes the circumstances of our lives can be quite difficult, and we don't see that any value could come out of this experience of suffering. Nevertheless, we trust in God's goodness. That's meritorious when we do that. Now, merit, when I merit reward from God, that merit can be shared with other members of the body of Christ. St. Paul tells us in Colossians 1, I fill up in my own flesh what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ for the sake of his body, the church. Genesis 18 tells us that God will spare the many on account of the righteousness of the few. Because of the communion of saints, the merit of one can avail for the many. Now, the most meritorious act of worship that the Church performs is the offering of Christ's body and blood in the holy sacrifice of the Mass. It is a meritorious offering because the victim and the priest who offer it are infinitely meritorious, namely Christ himself. We join our own prayers and sufferings with that of the sacrifice of the cross, and they are thereby hallowed and sanctified and made more worthy by their participation in Jesus. So like all sacrifices, like all merits, this has value not only for the one making the offering, but on behalf of those for whom it is made.
Soné, thank you again for your question. We appreciate hearing from you today on YouTube. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. Back to the phones right now. Here is Lee in Ohio, listening on Living Bread Radio. Hi, Lee. What's on your mind today?
Hi, Lee. The gentleman that called before this last one sort of like was talking about what I'm going to be talking about. One of Jesus' commandments was to love one another. And I was married, and my husband and I were having problems, and he agreed to go talk to the priest about the problems we were having. And my husband was an altar boy also growing up, and when I told the priest what was wrong, that there was, my husband wanted out, that he, said he didn't love me anymore. Well, the priest never prayed with us, never opened the Bible. When he heard my husband say he didn't love me anymore, he said, well, then you might as well leave her. So I don't understand how that priest, knowing, that God said we're to love one another, we had a child together too, and there was adultery. And I told him that on the phone ahead of time, and the priest asked, is there someone else to my husband? And my husband said no. He lied right to the priest. So how could people, really... I guess what I'm saying is how could a priest do that if he's following God? It was horrible advice.
Right. So he wasn't following God. You said it yourself. If he was following God, he wouldn't give that advice.
Right.
So he wasn't following God. That was a dumb as nails thing for the priest to say, in my judgment. Dumb as nails. And the proper response, if a man goes to a priest and says, I don't love my wife anymore, the proper response is, well, get busy loving your wife, knucklehead. Get busy loving your wife. Love is not a feeling. Love is not something that we wait spontaneously to float up in our hearts in response to a Hallmark movie. Love is a decision that we make to surrender our lives to something of value, namely the transcendent good of another human being, and to the society that we agree to create, which is bigger than me, namely the family. It's not about you. Get busy loving your wife. That's your moral responsibility. Don't do it, go to hell.
All right. And that's where we're going to leave that. This is a decision that you and I make with our wives every day.
Yeah, and the decision to stay with me is a tough one. So my wife is heroic in charity for doing it. Now, I'm a bit emphatic about this. You might have noticed,
Just a
okay?
little.
And it's because of how I was raised, thanks be to God, because I had fantastic parents. And, my father was a pious man who loved God and the church, but he didn't talk a lot about the faith, and he rarely quoted the Bible. But he quoted one verse to me frequently. It's the only verse of the Bible he ever quoted, and it was the one from Malachi, God hates divorce. And he, over and over and over again, it was like my dad had 3 pieces of advice for me. Study the liberal arts, never co-sign a loan, and don't divorce your wife. You don't do it. It's morally wrong. It's a grave offense against God. And in Scripture, when God wants to illustrate what infidelity against God looks like, he points to human infidelity as like the paradigm case, right? And if we want to image God in his love and covenant fidelity, marriage is the place to do it above all, right? And my dad, great guy, fantastic human being, always no personality at all, just flat as a pancake in terms of his affect, just no emotional ups and downs. And he used to always tell my mother, you're the most wonderful thing in the world. You're the cutest, nicest, sweetest. Every meal was the best thing he ever put in his mouth. Every outfit was the most beautiful thing she ever wore. And it was campy. I mean, it was really campy and kind of corny. And I asked him one time, I was like, Dad, couldn't you vary the compliments a little bit? I mean, it's like the same thing every day. Why the broken record of compliments to my mother? And he said to me, well, David, she needs to hear it, and so do I. And so do I, meaning like he recognized that he had to make a decision. He had to have practices, spiritual disciplines in his life of positively affirming his love for my mother every day to continually recreate and culture that reality in his soul, which he recognized. Did he have a feeling of for her? Of course he did. But he also recognized that it was a moral obligation, that he was commanded by God to love his wife. And so practicing the habit of love was his principal spiritual discipline. And I thank God, had I not had that example of marriage, it would have been much harder for me to be faithful in my marriage. I mean, Jill and I had our trials and troubles. I wrote a book about it called The Catholic Church Saved My Marriage, And I never will forget the day my wife looked at me and said, I hate you. And I was like, well, I hate me too, right? I mean, we're on the same page there, right? But we worked through it because of the Catholic faith and the example of my parents' fidelity and their commitment to love one another in spite of everything else. My mother used to jokingly say, murder maybe, divorce never. And that was a joke, of course. Not going to kill my dad. But that determination to stick it out, to do the right thing, to burn your parachute, as one Pentecostal pastor I knew once said.
Yep.
Burn your parachute. Commit yourself to God. Be willing to sacrifice your own hedonistic pleasure for the good of the other, and it'll work out.
Lee, please know of our prayers for you, and thank you so much for your call. It's Call to Communion here on EWTN. I want to tell you about a brand new book from EWTN Publishing. If you're watching David on camera right now, you can see that book, A Crisis in Culture, How Secularism is Becoming a Religion by Father George Rutler. In this timely and penetrating book, Father Rutler shows how the West's decades-long cultural assault against Christianity is finally reaching its inevitable conclusion, which is the self-destruction of our culture and society. But you know what? All is not lost. Father's going to talk about why the Catholic faith is the only means by which civilization can be restored. He talks about the difference between nostalgia and tradition, and why the 20th century has produced more martyrs than all previous Christian centuries combined. It is a wonderful book, not a light read, but an important read. A Crisis in Culture, How Secularism is Becoming a Religion. Available now at EWTNRC.com. Buy Catholic, shop Catholic, EWTNRC.com. And a quick program note that Father Rutler is going to be on with Father Mitch Pacwa tonight on EWTN Live, and that'll be at 8 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio and Television. Back to the phones right now for Mary in Downers Grove, Illinois, listening on Sirius XM Channel 130. Mary, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, I have a question in regards to remarriage. Possibly, my fiance-to-be, possibly, is Catholic. First marriage was civil, meaning not Catholic. What has to be done? Does that require an annulment on his part? I already have one.
Yeah, but it'll be falling off a log easy to get. I mean, there was a lack of form. I mean, he didn't have a canonical marriage, so I mean, it's absolutely going to be declared null and void, just lickety-split.
Yeah, there you go. Mary, thank you so much for your call. Let's go to Paula. Paula's in Apopka, Florida, listening also on Sirius. Hey, Mary, Paula, what's on your mind today, Paula?
Yes, good afternoon. My question has to do with heaven, and I think I know the answer, but I just want clarification. If you're not Catholic, can you get to heaven? And specifically, if you're a Baptist, or like my mom, she was born and raised Catholic, and at 40 years old took us out of the church. I'm back in for many years now, but she follows the New Age movement beliefs. But my other question is, if these people are living a life, basically, following the Beatitudes and the commandments, my mom, she's a wonderful woman. She prays all the time. She's not Catholic. Would she still be able to get into heaven when she dies?
Okay, I really appreciate the question. So the short answer to the question is yes. The short answer to the question is yes, because what has to happen for us to go to heaven is that we have to die with the love of God in our hearts. We have to be united to God and our neighbor in charity. That's what's required for getting into heaven. Now, the Catholic Church is the privileged path of access to that charity, because charity is a supernatural reality. It has to be poured into our hearts by the Holy Spirit. We can't manufacture it. We can have human love, but not supernatural charity without the help of God. And Christ, in his teaching, his example, his miraculous life, death, and resurrection, his instituting the church and the sacraments, has given us the objective means of grace to come into contact with that love of God, that charity of God that we need in our hearts in order to be saved. Now, the church tells us that that grace is available to those who are outside the church. But we cannot be presumptuous about that, right? So because God can reach anyone and has reached anyone, right? God makes of grace available to everyone. That's not a guarantee that he does so with every singular individual. Like, not every single individual on the planet necessarily attains to the life of heaven. They all have an opportunity. They don't necessarily all get there. And we are not judges. Like, it's not our job to judge, is this person or that person going to heaven or hell? We can't judge that, right? Well, all we can do is point out the objective means of grace. We can say, here's the truth about God, here's the truth about the moral life, here's the truth about Christ and the Catholic faith, here are the means of grace that God has given us, and invite people to participate, but then we will let God be the judge of consciences. And so, my advice to you with your mother or anybody else is, first of all, maintain that loving, virtuous friendship and relationship that you have, and try to be a source of goodness and forgiveness and fidelity and kindness and mercy in her life. And as you have opportunity to charitably share more of the truth, do so. Mm-hmm. Up to and including the very last moments of her life when maybe she might want to make a confession. Who knows?
Yeah.
So don't stop that up until the very end. But then even at that point, you don't ever despair, because only God knows.
Right. We do thank you for your call, Paula. Before we go on to another call, I want to get to Matt in the UK, who wants to know, what does lickety-split mean? Is this an Alabama term? It seems to be a favorite of Dr. Anders. Maybe you can explain lickety-split.
Yeah. So lickety-split is a Southern idiom, right? It's part of the Southern vernacular that means pretty darn quick.
There it is.
Right away. And my apologies to our radio friends in the UK and other Anglophone nations that might not be familiar with the proper way to speak English.
That is hilarious. Yes.
Y'all stay tuned in now.
That's right. Let's go to David in Portland, listening on the great Modern Day Radio. David, what's on your mind today?
I have a question about a man I know who pitched me this question. He's a Catholic man, but he follows something called the Berean call by one of the men behind it, his name is Dave Hunt, I think. It's been around a while, a Protestant mission of some kind. I had never heard of it. I looked a little bit about it online, and boy, it sure doesn't sound anything like Catholic to me, but I wondered if you had heard about it or know anything about it.
Yeah, so let's see. I've only heard about it in the last 2 seconds when you mentioned it, right? Now, a lot of times the Protestants are very fond of the story of the Bereans in the book of Acts 17, right? Because they imagine that the Bereans are sort of proto-Protestant in their attention to the Bible, which, of course, is a bad analogy and doesn't teach what they think it teaches. Yeah. So it's not uncommon to find Protestant ministries named after the Bereans. I don't know too much about it, but I'm pulling up their statement of faith as we speak. It's pretty standard, straight up evangelical Protestantism. I'm just kind of glancing at it right now, and not Catholic, and it's fundamentalist, dispensational Protestantism.
Okay. David, thanks so much for your call. We do appreciate that. Got an email from George who says, I often hear Scott Hahn, yourself, and other apologists talk about the liturgy. I don't understand this word. Please help me understand the word liturgy.
Yeah, sure, thanks. So the English word liturgy comes from a Greek word, liturgos, which actually means work, and it in the context of the New Testament, it referred to the formal acts of worship that Jews would perform in the temple as they fulfilled their priestly duty. So the father of John the Baptist, for example, when he has his vision of the angel Gabriel who tells him his wife's going to have a son, he was performing his priestly duty, making the sacrifices and so forth. And the Greek word there is liturgos, like he was doing his liturgy.
Oh, okay.
Right? And the word gets carried over into Christian theology to refer to the rites and symbols and rituals of Christian worship that were instituted by Christ. And Christ instituted many of them, or many different rituals, I should say. He instituted all the rituals that we have, but there are many different ones. That's what I mean. Yeah. Most important of which is the ritual of the Mass, the offering of Christ's body and blood under the appearance of bread and wine. And the other sacraments like baptism and penance and holy unction or anointing and ordination, marriage, and so forth, right? All of these are elements of the Church's liturgy, the symbols and rites and ceremonies of Christian worship instituted by Jesus.
Would it be putting too fine of a point on it to say, well, it's the same as the sacraments, or is it wider than that?
Well, it's wider than that because there are other elements of Christian worship that are non-sacramental, like the liturgy of the hours, or the divine office, which is the daily recitation of the Psalms by the Church.
So then you might say, as we're kind of wrapping things up here, you might say that it is the Catholic life. It is the life of a Catholic trying to do his or her very best to get to heaven?
No. How about the formal acts of worship prescribed by the Church, instituted by Christ?
Okay.
Because there's more to the Christian life than that. I mean, there's also my own interior life, which is not part of the liturgy necessarily.
Okay. Now I think I've got it. Okay. Well, thank you so much for that, and that's going to have to do it for us. We're right out the door. The only thing we couldn't get to is a great question from Clay, who actually disagreed with you regarding evolution, and we can probably tackle that on tomorrow's show. How's that?
Sounds good.
All right. Dr. David Anders, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Tom.
Don't forget, we do the program Monday through Friday here on EWTN live at 2 p.m. Eastern with an encore of that same show at 11 p.m. Eastern. Also, we bring you the best of Call to Communion Sunday afternoons at 2 p.m. Eastern. Our producer, Charles, picks out the best show in his humble opinion, and that's the one that we play for you on Sundays here on the radio. Also, the show is available by podcasting anytime, EWTNradio.net. On behalf of our fantastic team, I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders. See you tomorrow here on Call to Communion. God bless.
Hey y'all, this is Father Mitch Packer. Open Line Wednesday is next on EWTN Radio.